Hello and welcome to another exciting session of education in the United States. This week we're talking about teachers and the teaching profession. So you've done some readings that revolve around different issues that teachers face, especially starting out, what it means to be a professional in this profession. And so what I'm going to ask you to do today is we're going to have a very brief lecture on the teaching profession itself. And then I need everyone to participate in two different wiki activities, and you'll see when I explain them that I'm not asking you to do a whole lot. And then of course we have our seminar leadership. So this week's session is very much self-guided. This is a very short lecture introducing you to some basic ideas about the profession of teaching itself. And then I'm going to ask you all to talk a little bit about what a professional looks like, and then you'll have your seminar leadership. I would encourage also everyone to go back and look at my lecture on APA citations and encourage you as you write your essential questions, the second one is coming up, to think about if you're going to cite sources to not put in long quotations because you only have 500 words to make your case. So I would ask you to paraphrase and then cite the author that you're paraphrasing. I'd rather hear or read your words than someone else's when you only have a short space like 500 words to make your argument. But that's just a tidbit in terms of writing these things. They were very good otherwise. Okay, so I'm talking a little bit today about the teaching profession, okay, and the status of teachers. You may recall that for the bulk of American history, teaching has been considered, generally speaking, a feminine profession. And as such, teachers are paid very little. Firings are arbitrary. Most individuals with substantial education saw teaching as a way stop on their way to another career. And it's Horace Mann who's the first to systematically push for the professionalization of teaching in this country. But this doesn't really happen until the advent of teachers' unions during the Progressive Era. And that's where we start to see improvements be made to the professional standing of elementary and secondary teachers. And it's worth noting, and this is something you'll find in the Darling-Hammond book, that this is something that's unique to the United States. So the old phrase, those who can't do, teach, those who can do, that's not a joke that really gets made in other places, because in other places, folks realize that teaching is doing something. The idea that teaching isn't doing something, let alone that teaching isn't doing something valuable, it's just not common. And the reason for that is that for a long time in our country, teaching was not considered a profession. It was a job, but it wasn't a career. And that's how a lot of folks still view it, but that has changed over the last 100 years or so. Okay, now Ravitch spends some time discussing teachers' unions. So I thought it might be worth me elaborating a little bit on what teacher unions are. And a lot of you who go into public education will likely work in a unionized shop, especially if you're here in Connecticut or New York or New Jersey or Massachusetts. So there are two big national teachers unions. Your local union is typically an affiliate of one of these two unions. The NEA, National Education Association, was the first teachers union. It starts in the 1850s. Some teachers were members of statewide educational associations, not unions, mind you, but there was no cohesive organization to unite them. So at this time, as we studied over the last 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, excuse me, there were sweeping social changes in a fast-growing school system. So Thomas Valentine calls for teachers to unite in a nationwide organization, then called the National Teachers Association. In 1870, this organization that Valentine creates merges with several other educational professional organizations and rebands itself the National Education Association. Now, it's not a teachers' union per se, but a professional organization. So you might recall the Committee of 10 from 1893. That was started by the NEA. The early functions of the NEA were to advocate for teachers in public schools in a variety of ways. That meant professional development, curriculum writing, political advocacy, and lobbying. That's in the 1960s that the NEA takes on the de facto status as a labor union, meaning as an organization they engaged in collective bargaining on behalf of their members. Right, so that's what a union does, if you're not aware of that. It collectively bargains on behalf of its members with management for new contracts. The other very large teachers union, though not as large as the NEA, is the American Federation of Teachers, or the AFT. It's founded as a labor union in 1916. Right, so the NEA starts out as a professional organization. The AFT is always a teachers union. John Dewey was a member of the AFT, and they are from the start directly affiliated with the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, mostly known as the AFL-CIO. And it's a controversial, so teachers unions are a controversial issue. Finding an image to show for you here, one that was balanced, was nearly impossible. If you search teachers unions under Google Image, you'll find a lot of political arguments, political cartoons, both pro and con, mostly con. But it's an issue that's taken on or become part of the national debate over education policy. 2 summers ago, there was a strike of teachers in Chicago. In Wisconsin, Governor Walker worked to remove collective bargaining from teachers and other public employees. And in the interest of full disclosure, it's worth mentioning that I was a union member for 6 years in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. When I was a union member in New Jersey, I was a member of the NEA. That was the national affiliation that we had. And when I was a union member in Pennsylvania, we were affiliated with the AFT. I should also mention that as a union member, I was involved in a prolonged contract dispute. I walked in picket lines, and I'm happy to talk about those things with you at office hours, but the only reason I mention them here is that as I explain the benefits and criticisms, I do have a clear bias in this issue. Okay, but I thought I'd elaborate on some of the arguments that Ravitch talks about. So to start with, why are unions beneficial? Or what's the argument that's made here? Well, one reason that folks join teachers' union is that teachers need protections to think, speak, and teach without fear. There's a history of teacher harassment, particularly in New York City. That's where the AFT takes on a nationwide position in this debate. Teachers are a vulnerable population, and they have been historically. Teaching is risky, right? Parental and student accusations are common when a grade gets handed down that the student or parent doesn't like. And the union makes sure that due process is followed in evaluating those events. That's what tenure is. Okay, the term tenure refers to due process, so that if a teacher is going to be removed from a position, that administration follows every protocol in doing so. And then, of course, another reason for teachers to join unions is that it results in better salaries and better benefits. Teachers are generally, even with unions, underpaid for their level of training. Of course, not everybody is a fan of teachers' unions. There's several criticisms. Critics charge that unions lead to mediocre student achievement. Now, this is more of a logical argument than an argument based in empirical data. So the logic goes that if teachers are protected and there's no risk to their jobs, and that their pay rises are guaranteed year to year, which is what the union does, then there's no motivation for them to teach well. They'll teach the same lessons year in and year out. I've done a review of the studies. As part of my graduate work, I did a review of all the studies that have looked at this particular issue, whether unionization leads to mediocre teaching. And so researchers have used all types of data to try and determine whether students are doing well or not. And they've looked at the state level, comparing states that outlaw unions versus states that don't outlaw unions. They've looked at individual districts, they've looked at SAT scores, they've looked at scores on the NAEP exams. Right? There's all different measurements for student achievement. Now, part of the problem with trying to establish this is that, because we have so many different measures, defining student achievement is a challenge. But what the pool of data seems to suggest is that there's no correlation, positive or negative, to student achievement and teaching. So this logic holds a lot of water for some folks, but it's not one that can be verified empirically speaking. There's also a popular charge that tenure makes it impossible to fire ineffective teachers. Right? That once a teacher makes tenure, they simply can't be fired. In responding to that particular criticism, as I mentioned before, tenure is due process by which a teacher is removed from their posts. All right? It's created because teachers have been removed from their posts for all sorts of arbitrary reasons. It's typically granted by the administrator 3 or 4 years into a teaching career. And you can deny tenure or be denied tenure for all sorts of reasons. Teaching is sort of a self-selective industry. We know that beyond 5 years, 50% of teachers don't survive. Right? After 5 years, half of those who have started are gone by their own choices. They've decided to leave. So those that remain, the incentive there for tenure is that teaching's not easy and it doesn't pay well, but at the very least there's job security if you can stick it out and do it for a number of years. But teachers can be fired. The onus is on the administrator to follow the process of removing teachers. And I have, in my career, certainly seen teachers who ought to have been removed who simply weren't because the administrators were admittedly busy with their other responsibilities. But to say teachers can't be fired isn't quite true. It is difficult to fire them. Finally, and this is what Ravitch is arguing, ed reform is really about, or criticisms of teachers' unions is really about, is that unions prevent education reform that is often conceptualized as applying data-driven measures to teacher evaluation, raises, and retention. Right, so that teacher success would be measured by student test scores. Of course, the common argument is that in the real world, the so-called real world, people are hired and fired based on their credentials and then their continued job performance, and that teachers aren't really hired and fired in that way. Of course, these measures that would be applied to teachers that unions are fighting ignore prior learning of students, the multitude of backgrounds of students, that students aren't randomly distributed across schools, that studies show linking student test scores to teacher evaluations cause teachers to marginalize and ignore struggling students, and so on. So what I've done is, this isn't a mandatory thing, but on the discussion board, I have posted a discussion question asking you your thoughts on unions. I thought that might be a space, if you'd like to, that we could talk about unions, but that's not a mandatory thing. I also posted a link to this PBS documentary about Michelle Rhee. So Diane Ravitch, if you're using the same edition as I am, in her book, touches on Michelle Rhee, but her information is a little bit out of date. So if you're interested in Michelle Rhee, and she is a pretty important figure in ed reform, it's worth watching this documentary. If you don't have time to watch it, that's okay. Here's what I'll do. I'll give you a quick primer on her career right now, and then we can move on. So Michelle Rhee was an English teacher through Teach for America, a controversial program that allows students to enter low-functioning schools very quickly without going through the typical or traditional teacher preparation. And she, in her tenure as the chancellor of schools in D.C., used her time as a TFA candidate to, say, look, this is what I did, and scores were raised. Scores did rise during her second and third years of teaching, but not nearly to the extent that she claimed, right? So she was talking about some pretty wild increases in student gains in reading, and she did increase those test scores, or her students did increase their test scores, but not to the extent that she was saying. So she was chancellor of the D.C. public schools. She inherited a very troubled system. In her first year, she closed 23 schools, fired 36 principals, and cut approximately 121 office jobs, moves that were not exactly popular at the time, but moves she felt she needed to make. In 2010, Rhee and the unions agreed on a new contract that offered 20% pay raises and bonuses of up to $20,000 or $30,000 for strong student achievement in exchange for weakening teachers' seniority and protections at the end of teachers' tenure for 1 year. Right, so they kind of did away with tenure, but there was these huge incentives to raise student scores. Under this new agreement, Rhee fired 241 teachers, the vast majority of whom received poor evaluations, and put 737 additional school employees on notice. Since 2007, secondary schools have improved their standardized pass rates by about 14% in reading and 17% in math, while elementary school pass rates have improved from 6% in reading to 50% in math. So we do see something of an improvement after she made these reforms. However, some parents and community members said that Rhee's speed left them without input on the changes, especially regarding school closures. Some parents alleged that the firing process was neither transparent nor fair. And in 2010, the DC mayoral election resulted in the mayor not finding re-election, and many observers saw this as a referendum on Rhee's unpopular tenure as a school chancellor. Now, that's sort of where Diane Ravitch leaves it. What Diane Ravitch doesn't talk about, because at the time of writing this wasn't public knowledge, but there have been investigations into those accomplishments I mentioned earlier, those increases in the test scores. In 2008, McGraw-Hill flagged 96 schools, including 8 of the 10 that have received awards from Rhee, for wrong-to-right erasures. Okay, what that means is they noticed a high number of students erasing wrong answers and filling in right answers. Among them, the Noyes Elementary School, which was marked as a National Blue Ribbon School for its improvements, was singled out by Rhee and district officials as a model of educational reform, had an abnormally high rate of answer changes in 2007, 2008, and 2009. One 2009 test showed a 12.7 per student right to wrong correction ratio, in contrast to the DC average for that same test, which had less than 1% of their students making those right to wrong answers. Statisticians stated to USA Today that the odds are better for winning the Powerball grand prize than having that many erasures by chance. So that calls those gains into question. After DC, Rhee has left Ed Policy and currently is the head of Student First, a political lobbying organization on school reform. And you can imagine the policies that they push for. Okay, so here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Okay, the seminar leadership is part of your participation grade, as are your participation in these wiki activities, but these don't count towards your 3 comments minimum a week. Okay, the first thing you're going to do is head over to this wiki activity the first year. If you have not taught yet, what I want you to do is list one resource you would expect to find during your first year of support to support your growth as an educator. If you have taught, list one resource you expected to have but was absent in your first year. Okay, I think you'll see how this ties to our readings. Secondly, I want everyone to list one quality, just one, of an outstanding teacher. I want you to do this as soon as you hear this lecture. Just head over to the wiki page, edit it, one quality. At the end of the week, what I want you to do is return to this wiki space and answer these questions, looking at everyone's list. Okay, so now that everybody's contributed, which of these qualities do you see in either of the Ravitch or the Mulheny and Sagan articles? How could we possibly measure these qualities? And how could these qualities be supported in schools? Okay, and as always, make sure you're participating in our seminar leadership.